The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, April 27th, 2020. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps and steps and steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Yale historian Frank Snowden. His book, Epidemics and Society, From Black Death to the Present. Meanwhile, Republicans fretting a presidential and Senate lost, and Trump threatening the post office unless it hikes costs, cuts union. We're looking at a tsunami of bankruptcies building as loans to millionaires revealed in the last version of the PPP. Biden, meanwhile, insists he'd pursue a much, much more generous bailout. A 27-year-old Larry King episode substantiates at least a part of Biden accuser Tara Reade's claims. Mike Pompeo looking for UN action against Iran, claiming they broke the deal that Donald Trump broke. And USDA incompetence has let millions of pounds of food rot, while bread lines, food bank lines, I should say, demand soars. Rent strike, can't pay, won't pay, being organized by Housing Justice for All, and Trump insisting that 1,000 West Point cadets return to New York State to hear the speech that he's going to give for graduation. All that and more on today's program. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. It is another Monday, and we are endeavoring to persevere. I will tell you right up front that the screaming you may have heard in the background of Friday's show has continued unabating in my household, and you may hear again today. We were just, I was just sharing that with Matt and Brendan before the show started. Hope your weekend went well. We are still basically in the midst of things. Georgia, a couple other states have, I guess, I want to say opened up. It's not really the right word. They have relaxed their stay-at-home rules, basically so that they can get out from under their unemployment obligations and support for local businesses. That's basically the dynamic that we're looking at. We are nearing 55,000 deaths in this country. We were told by the administration that the models all said 60,000 tops. Of course, we've reached that in less than 5 weeks from when they told us that. Fortunately, it appears in New York that things may have at least plateaued, maybe slightly gone down for the past couple of days. But it's difficult to sort of measure these things that precisely, so we will see. On Wednesday, we're going to play the interview I did with one of the country's top epidemiologists who really at least lays out broad strokes, what we can expect and what we're going to need to do as a country. But frankly, I don't know that we have the leadership coming from any quarters at this point providing any of that. Donald Trump is a lunatic, aided and abetted by the Republican Party. We'll get into, his response to his own claiming that people should inject themselves with bleach or clean out their insides or get super ultraviolet light. But make no mistake about this, folks. And the Democrats have been just horrible at this. Horrible. What we are dealing with is not just Donald Trump's insanity and incompetence. What we're dealing with is unfettered Republican governance. There was Matt Iglesias tweeted out something where he retweeted the former head of the FDA, who had written in January, we need to ramp up antibody testing for coronavirus. He wrote this in January in an op-ed. Now, he did so when he was out of office because he was pushed out of office because Grover Norquist, he of Club for Growth, wanted him out because of what he was saying about vaping. About vaping. You remember Donald Trump when Alex Azar, who apparently now Health and Human Services, apparently they're looking for a replacement for him. When he tried to get Donald Trump's attention in January over the coronavirus, Trump was still obsessed about the vaping. When do we get the vaping back? When the admiral who sat on the National Security Council to coordinate pandemic response for this country and oversaw essentially a small agency to do that very same thing, his position was eliminated. It wasn't because Donald Trump woke up in the middle of the night. It was like, oh my gosh, we're just spending too much on pandemic readiness. It was because of Republican ideology. It was because John Bolton wanted the guy out. A waste of time. Donald Trump did not assemble this crew of cronies. Mike Pence did. All of the Republicans who were put in there, short of the roommate, Jared's roommate or Alex Azar's, good buddy who used to raise labradoodles, who's now in charge of our pandemic response. These people were staffed by Republicans. And so keep in mind that what we're seeing is all along the line in terms of our readiness, in terms of our response. These are all policy choices. There were bad ones, but it was a policy choice made by a Republican administration. Not incompetence. Somebody didn't forget, I was supposed to renew his contract to sit on the National Security Council. And I just got caught up in so much stuff this weekend, I couldn't get to it. And then I realized I hadn't renewed it. And then he got a different job and I screwed up. No, these were all choices. And when these choices, in terms of the response, I don't know if Nancy Pelosi is just incompetent or what, but I don't know if we have time to play this sound. We'll get to this. But somebody wrote me the other day when I was critical of Nancy Pelosi. And I would turn their attention to the panic that other Democrats in the House are sounding about the complete unpreparedness to deal with any of this. And now Nancy Pelosi's finally feeling a little bit of heat and going on and getting incredibly defensive about it. Well, good. I hope she gets more defensive about it because they screwed up. I was in a good mood a couple of minutes ago. I don't know what happened. Folks, we got a little quick plugs and notices, just two things. This will be, we will put the links underneath the description of the podcast and this YouTube. Two things. One is there's a friend of the show is organizing the collection of N95 masks, face protectors, and shields, and people who have 3D 3D printers, hazmat suits, incubator protective acrylic box, gowns, hair and head coverings, shoe coverings. They are being distributed to different people on in hospitals in New York City. And you can email Rachel at rchaos@chaosbuilt.com. Also, friend of the show is looking for information, and this is just an appeal to those of you out there. I don't I said something about my sound, and I got about 50 emails, but hopefully there's some folks who know about this. We're looking for info on a service dog or emotional support dog for a child with special needs. I'm looking for sourcing and for perhaps funding resources. If you're familiar with any of that, send us an email at majorityreporters@gmail.com. Put the word dog in the subject line. Obviously, these situations are causing a lot of stress for people in general with kids. Those kids with who are atypical in some ways or have any type of special needs, it becomes that much harder. And so if anybody has any information about that, send us an email at majorityreporters@gmail.com. Next up, I'm really happy to support this organization. This ad is a warning. Our democracy is under attack from the U.S. Supreme Court. In the middle of a deadly global pandemic, people across Wisconsin were planning on voting absentee to keep themselves and their families safe. But the night before the election, 5 Republican justices on the Supreme Court told thousands of people they'd have to choose between risking their lives and forfeiting their right to vote. Supreme Court favoring Republican interests over our democracy is nothing new. They've gutted the Voting Rights Act. They invited billionaires and corporations to spend unlimited amounts trying to influence our elections. They gave a green light to gerrymandering, green light to voter ID laws, green light to voter roll purges. And now a progressive movement is rising up to fight back because it's quite possible the Wisconsin case won't be the last 2020 showdown over voting rights to be settled in the courts. We simply cannot trust this court to put aside partisan views and protect people's right to vote. Our courts are becoming too political. It's time to say enough. Learn more about how you can join the fight by visiting demandjustice.org/majority. That's demandjustice.org/majority. This is, it's a great organization. Really important. Really important. I spoke about what the ED Brian Fallon said. I mentioned it the other day. I've said it in the past on here. He wants to make sure that the next Democratic president appoints no corporate lawyers to the federal judiciary. It's time that we start to break up that monopoly on some level that they have. Meanwhile, finding the perfect present for mom, always tough, especially if you don't have the luxury of celebrating Mother's Day together in person, which a lot of people, I know, myself included, maintaining social distance from our parents because of their health and to protect their health. However, you can give your gift, you can gift your mom the chance to connect with loved ones through StoryWorth. I've told you people in the past that my folks, I've given them StoryWorth. It's over a year now, I think. And I will say that and basically the way it works is that StoryWorth, they send your loved ones, doesn't have to be just your mom, but they send your loved ones. It's a service that basically prompts them to answer questions or to just jog memories, so that they share stories on a weekly basis. It's fun. It's meaningful. It is great for relatives you don't see often. It's great for older relatives. It's great so you have something for your kids to see what you're, and you learn stuff as a kid yourself. They get questions like, what was one of the greatest surprises you ever got? What was your favorite, I don't know, car as a kid or something like that? Things that just jog the memory. And then you read the weekly stories on a weekly basis. And then after a year, StoryWorth will compile all the answers and photos into a beautiful keepsake book that's shipped for free, something your family will treasure forever. And in this instance, it's also, a good way to keep in touch. You go over the stories. And, my mom is having some memory issues. And so this has been helpful and interesting. It's a process, but it's going to be very worth it at the end. You can give your mom the most meaningful gift this year with StoryWorth. Get started right away without the need for shipping by going to storyworth.com/majority. You get $10 off your first purchase. That's storyworth.com/majority for $10 off. And lastly, got a lot of time at home? Well, take advantage of it. Whether alone or with others, with the breakout, Hunt a Killer. This murder mystery game is the best way to switch things up from constantly watching TV and scrolling on your phone. Hunt a Killer reinvents the way that we interact with murder mysteries. You go from being viewer safe in the comfort of your own home to an investigator actively working to solve the case. It's a murder mystery subscription box. It has over 2,000 5-star reviews on Trustpilot. With each delivery, you sift through a pile of documents, evidence, audio recordings, case files, eliminating suspects until you crack the case. You can even join Hunt a Killer's spoiler-free online community. Has over 100,000 members, so you can share theories and help each other out. Plus, part of the proceeds of every box goes to the Cold Case Foundation. I can tell you, this is a game that Mile and I have been playing for some time now. And it's great. You get like a new episode every month. And we've got fortunately, we don't have our bulletin board up here, but I brought all the case files. And you crack a case, and then a new season starts. It's a great way to get the kid off of her phone for, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours, which is huge, believe me, on any given evening. Right now, just for our listeners, you can go to huntakiller.com/majority. Use promo code majority at checkout for 20% off your first box. Head to huntakiller.com/majority for 20% off your first box. Head to huntakiller.com for 20% off and show your support for this podcast. That's huntakiller.com/majority. All right, folks.
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Please use no speakerphone and have your one comment or question ready.
I'm just calling into the
Sam to call out your area code. Sam will be with you shortly.
Okay, there we go. Bear with me, sir.
Hello?
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break. Back after this. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Emeritus Professor of History of Medicine from Yale University, author of Epidemics and Society, From Black Death to the Present, Yale historian Frank Snowden. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here.
And we're speaking to you. I believe you're in Rome. Is that right? You were obviously pursuing some research at the time, and got stuck.
You're absolutely right. I am in Rome. I came to do research actually on a different topic, and I did get upended by coronavirus. And in fact, I also not only had lockdown, but I also was in quarantine at home because I actually caught the virus as well. Now I'm just reassessing exactly what and when my travel plans will be.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're feeling okay and that that's what you're contemplating. So let's jump into your book, and I know that you've been rather busy as of late because of the book and coronavirus. You write that epidemics hold a mirror up to society. Tease that out for us.
Yes, I'd be delighted to do that. I believe that the diseases that afflict a society are not random events, that in fact, we as a people, we create the channels that microbes exploit in as they move and challenge us as a people. To make the point, I might make a contrast between two separate times. Let's take first, very briefly, the Industrial Revolution, and imagine the chaos of the industrial cities, which are filling with people from the countryside in an unplanned, frenetic way, so that there's overcrowding, their hygiene is rock bottom, there are no building regulations, people live in cramped and extraordinary tenements that Dickens describes, with no running water, no safe drinking water, no sewage systems, none of that. It's in that sort of place and environment, that stage of evolution of our society, that diseases that are spread by the oral fecal route, like Asiatic cholera and typhoid, thrive. Since then, we no longer live in that world, and typhoid and cholera, because of the sanitary revolution, we have eliminated those paths for those microbes to reach us. And so you may have occasional cases, mostly travelers, but you don't have the possibility of those being big killers in New York, let us say, or Rome. So we now contrast that with the era of globalization, and that has not made us immune to these afflictions. It's simply, we live inevitably in a world of microbes, and it's a different group of microbes that are now able to challenge us successfully. We've created through the globalization, we have now, we're overpopulated. We're nearly 8 billion people in the globe. And we also have an industrial society in which we seem to believe that industrial growth infinitely is possible, although the resources of the planet are finite. Those two premises together mean that we're destroying the environment around us in a rapacious and unprecedented manner, and that means we're destroying animal habitat. That in turn means that people come into contact with animals with whom they would not have had such contact either frequently or at all in the past, and that sets the stage for what we see now of ever increasing numbers of spillover events in which animal, that is, from animals that are reservoirs for various pathogens, these pathogens now come into contact with people who have contact with those animals. That is the origin of the coronavirus pandemic in Wuhan. Then we have to imagine major cities, and those cities teeming and crowded and all linked by rapid air transport, where that millions of people were constantly in motion, so that a microbe that, let us say, picking a place at random on the planet at Jakarta experiences in the morning will have broken out in New York or Rome or Los Angeles by evening. And so if you put all of that together, we have now created pathways from animals we didn't know or rather have contact with in the past for those microbes to expand. They broke out in Wuhan among shoppers at a market where they had bats, and the shoppers took those microbes home with them, and they contaminated their environment at home, and it spread in clusters in apartments and apartment buildings, and then moved beyond that to neighborhoods and then whole cities. Then those microbes were, because they're spread by air, and were very vulnerable, therefore, to pulmonary viruses that are spread through the air, they were readily transmitted, and they were transmitted across the globe. And so we see this disease, to which, as a globalized society, we're extraordinarily vulnerable, is now spreading relentlessly across the globe. That's a very quick idea of how this disease is now demonstrating who we are as a global, unequal, densely populated urban civilization.
I want to stay with sort of the bigger picture, but I just want to add, like, what I learned of the Ebola virus was literally just that, like literally somebody on the edge, a child on the edge of of expansion and being exposed to, I guess it was fecal matter from bats or something.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. In fact, I would say that isn't there a message here for us that we've had avian flu a number of times beginning in 1997, and we've had MERS, we've had SARS, we've had Ebola, we have the coronavirus. The point is, these are all airborne. These are all pathogens that begin. Sorry, not all airborne. Ebola is not. But those are all pathogens that begin with animal reservoirs. And if Ebola began, as you were talking about, with deforestation in West Africa and bats that had lived in the canopy of the forest, when that was gone, they moved close to human habitations. And what happened was a 4-year-old boy was playing in the hollow of a tree where bats had found refuge and were nesting in the thousands. And with their excrement dropping down to the bottom of the tree, the boy breathed in the virus, and he then took it home, and it then spread to his family, neighbors, and the neighbors worked in the big city. And so soon you had this. That's the origin of all of the cases in West Africa in the Ebola epidemic there.
And so, I mean, as I've read some of your book, the idea of human beings just being sort of like almost like a circuit, and the society that we build at any given time, the way that we're organizing just changes the path of the circuit essentially. And so, I mean, is that why we get pandemics, or is that why the pandemics like this are sometimes, sort of clustered on some level, because society sort of responds to the way that it is made up and the circuit that it's created for something like this to pass. And then over time, it starts to go further in a different direction that creates new vulnerabilities?
I would like what you said, 90% I'm very enthusiastic. I do believe we create the circuits exactly as you said, and microbes exploit those, and the circuits that are created depend on the world that we've created. We, epidemics, are not hitting us randomly. They are exploiting fault lines that we ourselves have created. But what I wanted to add to that I think is critical, particularly looking at today's events, is that this is not something that was doomed to happen. What happens when we're challenged, the challenge was inevitable, but there was every possibility of being prepared for this particular challenge, this what has now become a pandemic of coronavirus. We have been receiving warnings from epidemiologists, virologists, public health officials for 25 years, well, since not quite, since 1997, all saying that an event like this was inevitable. To me, the most disturbing sentence, actually a question, of the entire outbreak was the question phrased by President Trump, in which he asked, who could have known? In my opinion, everyone should have known, because the world was warned. We had a number of, if you like, dress rehearsals with avian flu, SARS, Ebola, MERS, and in 2005, we had testimony before Congress, which was considering a pandemic emergency, and it's extraordinary to read now. They actually more or less predicted what we're now facing, right. That Fauci, in fact, and the Director General then of the CDC, Julie Gerberding, actually testified before the Senate, and they used the analogy of a hurricane. They said that if you live in the Caribbean, meteorologists can tell you that a hurricane is coming. Scientifically, it's certain. They can't tell you when and how strong the hurricane will be, but they know that it's coming. They said in exactly the same way, virologists can tell you that a pulmonary pandemic challenge is coming. They can't tell you how terrible it will be, and they can't give you a date, but it's coming is inevitable. And just as in the hurricane situation, it would be extremely important to prepare for it. And that's, in fact, what we didn't do.
Right.
There was a flurry of preparation in 2005 to 7, a flurry around Ebola, but then everything went back literally to business as usual with cost cutting and all of the vulnerabilities. So I would say that this is a catastrophe of unpreparedness as much as it is simply of an epidemic challenge that was inevitable. The point is we did very, very little, too late and too little to prevent it. This was a preventable pandemic.
And just to reiterate, when you say pulmonary, that is an indication on some level that we shored up as a world, I guess, broadly speaking, issues of sanitation and like, just like basic, I guess, hygiene on some level, right? I mean, because if we still had that problem, we'd be susceptible to something that would be more transmittable through such means. But because we closed off that avenue, or not just because we closed off that avenue, but because we're susceptible to air issues, and our air travels literally from, like you say, from Jakarta to Chicago in an airplane, then we're susceptible to something like that.
That's right. We are susceptible exactly to something like that. It was what's scary about 2005 to 7, and listening now to Fauci and to Gerberding, is that they actually identify specifically that this will be a pulmonary pandemic virus that will challenge us. And they actually, then there is discussion of what might that look like and what are our vulnerabilities. And the extraordinary thing is the vulnerabilities are listed there in the discussion before the US Senate. It was known what needed to be done. And the tragedy of this is that we did not do it as a world and as a country.
Let's talk a little bit about you know, you mentioned that sort of that modernity has created these sort of pathways, right? That sort of dictate the flow, if you will, of a pandemic. What about how wealth inequality? What about the sort of you know, when we talk about modernity, we're talking about, you know, technology in terms of travel and advances in some areas and not in others. But what about sort of and I guess, you know, I'm trying not to limit it to my perspective in the United States, but broadly speaking, this is an issue around the globe. How does like wealth inequality implicate that?
I'm delighted that you raised that, because that is another part of our globalized world, which is to say that since the Second World War, the inequality between social classes has broadened exponentially through the industrial world on the one hand, and between the developed nations of the industrial world and the developing nations of the industrial world. And so you have two fault lines of inequality. One, if you like, let's look at the example of the United States. And initially it sounds as though a disease transmitted through the air is, should we say, a democratic equal opportunity infection. It's true, it can make anyone ill. All you have to do is be present at the wrong time at the wrong place and to be breathing, and you breathe in the air exhaled by a patient. You share that air and you incorporate the microbes into your lungs. So that can happen to anyone. And initially it seemed as though skiers, holiday makers, we heard about Prince Charles, Boris Johnson, Tom Hanks, it seemed elite members of society were very vulnerable. But actually, that's misleading. That was the early part of the disease. And what we've seen since is that it is, in fact, people who are impoverished, who are disadvantaged economically, who are overwhelmingly becoming sick and dying. If you look at the figures for Manhattan, it clearly shows, or New York City as a whole, that you can map the virus victims by illness or death over the disadvantaged zip codes. And it's those places that are particularly suffering. And African Americans and Hispanics in New York City have experienced this disease, contracting it at twice the rate of the white population of New York City. And this is happening for really simple reasons. One, the lack of access to medical care. And that if you live in a inner city ghetto and you don't have the possibility of doing what we've all been told, which is to practice social distancing. How do you social distance in an overcrowded housing development in which not only do you share the common space with lots of people, but also, in addition to that, there is terrible hygienic conditions, and washing your hands and all of that is not really so easy. So domestically, it's a major issue that this is preferentially attacking people, the poor, and the poor have a greater burden of pre-existing conditions of obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, that in so many cases, if they're not covered by insurance, they aren't being treated for those. So those are good reasons that the poor in our country are suffering. But then if you look on the international level, it's also entirely the case that we're seeing this disease, which started in China, then moved to Europe, and then over to North America. It's now moving, rampaging in the poorer countries of the world. And this brings into question the fact that over decades, those countries relative, I don't mean they're becoming poor absolutely, but relatively compared to the industrial world, there is a process of growing distance in advantages. And you have, imagine preaching the idea of social distancing in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, right, or in the townships of South Africa, or in the shawls of Mumbai, where it's impossible because of the extraordinary overcrowding, the lack of guaranteed water, the lack of soap. All of those mean that this disease is running rampant in the third world, and it's setting off as a secondary, very possible consequence, one that the UN has sounded an alarm. This may lead to massive famine in Africa and in Latin America, and social calamities and tensions and all that follow in their wake. So poverty, we can't really discuss this disease with accurately and explain its epidemiology unless we include poverty within it.
As you were saying that, I mean, I want to turn a little bit to maybe not so much what we can expect in the wake of something like this, or maybe so, but also like, you know, what history teaches us. But as you were talking about the favelas in Rio, I'm reminded of the response to things like cholera in the 1800s in France, and could you touch on that and just sort of like how these pandemics can be exploited or reacted to? I mean, I would imagine there's a slate of sort of generic responses that run from in the wake of these things that and I want to talk about that, you know, that range from, I would imagine, you know, like to paranoia, or maybe some communalization of society, or maybe the opposite. But speak specifically about how like pandemics have been exploited in the past to it's usually by the powerful versus the least powerful.
Right. I would say that an essential feature of the history of pandemics is that they're not simply interchangeable causes of death and suffering. They are actually all individuals. They're all horrible. I mean, it's if I say individuals, it's a terribly dysfunctional family, if you like. But the point is that they're not the same, and their impacts, their legacy on society and the people they strike are really very different. And the disease that spreads.
Is that a function, excuse me, I mean, is that a function of the nature of the disease? Because that you know, that causes us to remap society in certain ways, or is that a function of the specific context in which the disease hits?
Right. I think it's a combination of the two, so that diseases that are, let us say, purely transmitted easily through the air, smallpox, for example, in its time, really did strike everyone and anyone. It was, whereas a disease transmitted through contaminated food and water like typhoid, or the example you gave of cholera, that really is overwhelmingly a disease of the poor rather than of the wealthier classes who live in an entirely different urban environment they may live in the same city, but they live in large, spacious houses, well served with pure water supplies. They did in the 19th century too, and they live spaciously, and they have high cleanliness standards. So although they live in the same city, the wealthy and the poor in the 19th century, they actually inhabited different worlds. So that if you look at who was struck in Paris, the example of France, or in Naples, an example of Italy, or Hamburg in Germany, one sees that this really is a disease of working people rather than of the wealthy. It's they who succumb to Asiatic cholera. And this in turn has a knock-on effect. That is to say, if a disease is clearly following, if its class predilections are obvious and almost without exceptions, then the poor begin to wonder if this is actually a natural event, or is this in fact something that is being manipulated, that is being fostered by wealthy and powerful people to rid themselves of a social problem. And so, and then at the same time, if there was in the 19th century, people didn't understand at that time in the way that we do about microbes and how they're spread. And so there were, in people's minds, there were alternative epidemiologies. The poor thought in terms of a class plot, and the wealthy classes thought in terms of filth, and filth is part of the dangerous classes who had risen up so often during the early industrial revolution and riots, and even in revolutions at numerous times. And so there was a fear of working people, and the fact that they had now become with cholera medically dangerous as well really sharpened class tensions. And we see this in the brutal, it's not only cholera, obviously, I'm saying this is added on to other issues, economic, political, religious, all kinds of tensions, but the cholera exacerbates them. And I think that's part, as you were saying, of the violence of the repression of the revolutions in 1849, in which middle classes and upper classes and aristocracy saw an opportunity to put down the dangerous classes who had threatened them so severely in 1830, 1848, and in numerous riots since. And in 1871, the repression of the Paris Commune is actually almost a 19th century precursor of ethnic cleansing in our own time. And I would say that the issue of disease rather sharpened the edges of social tensions that were already there, and of course pre-existed the cholera and had other causes and were the root causes, but I would say that the cholera sharpened those edges and made the conflict much more violent and intense.
I know you don't necessarily address the Spanish flu too much in your book, but do you think that there is, or maybe even from cholera, do you think there is embedded in our sort of social DNA, if you will, our attitudes towards, our attitudes in terms of like, people living in poverty or the working class or the aristocracy, as it were? I mean, how much of our worldview can be traced to events like this in the past, that we form these sort of ideas that get sort of like just built into our sense of society and of people?
Right. I'm happy to talk about Spanish flu, 1918. The reason being that it really is a counterexample. It's a really good counterexample of a disease transmitted through the air, a pulmonary disease that you get from breathing the same air as people who already have the disease. And that disease, I think, is the best example I can think of what might be called a really democratic disease. It was a disease that afflicted more or less all social classes, and it passed through communities and more or less struck everyone. And so it didn't contribute to social tensions of the kind that we've been describing. And it's interesting that it left, in a way, despite its massive mortality, it killed enormous, some people estimate as many as 100 million people worldwide, far more people than the First World War at the same time killed. And yet, it's written about as a leading historian of these events, writes in his title of his book, America's Forgotten Pandemic. And that really is true around the world, that this pandemic didn't leave a lasting legacy. People were much more preoccupied with the First World War and the peacemaking and the Bolshevik Revolution, all of which were around the very same time. And then the disease didn't besiege communities the way the coronavirus is doing, or the bubonic plague, or even cholera did. It passed rapidly through communities, making everyone sick and killing a sizable but limited number of people. And so it was this rapid passage of the disease that was another factor that meant that people that didn't exploit those social tensions in a way that the coronavirus, which is besieging communities, is doing at this very moment.
And that's fascinating. I mean, I've become aware of, obviously, the past 6 weeks or so about how much at least in this country, the psyche has sort of flushed that from the system. And did the Spanish flu in any way implicate all of those other events that were going on? Because I learned from your book that the Haitian Rebellion was the outcome of the Haitian Rebellion, and even like Louisiana Purchase, was in some way a function of yellow fever.
Yes. With regard to Haiti, it's important to realize that it's not always that pandemic diseases strengthen authoritarianism. And indeed, one of the features of the Haitian Rebellion is that what happened is that there was a story of differential immunity. Haiti was the most wealthy colony in the world. It's hard to imagine that now, but at the early 19th century it was, because of its enormously productive sugar plantations. During the French Revolution, with the neutralization of French power, there was an enormous slave rebellion that was led in the end by Toussaint Louverture. Napoleon, after a regime change in France, emerges as the emperor at the end of the revolution, and he decides that he wants to restore the sugar plantation economy built on slavery, African slavery, to Haiti because of its wealth, because he wants to use it as a base to reproject French imperial ambitions back onto North America. And he's actually not at all happy with this world turned upside down and the rebellion led by Africans. He was a racist at his time. So this yellow fever, in fact, is a disease that Europeans had no immunity to. Africans, on the other hand, had a degree of herd immunity, as we're calling it now, to the yellow fever. And so Napoleon sent this huge armada of 60,000 troops to Haiti, soldiers and sailors. By the middle of the summer, after he sent them in the early spring, the French commander wrote back to Paris that 80% of his soldiers and sailors had died of this one cause, not combat, but of yellow fever, and that the remaining 20% of his soldiers and sailors were convalescing and therefore useless for military activity. And so there was no alternative to surrender. And so we have, as a result, overwhelmingly of the yellow fever, the victory of the slave rebellion. And so in 1804, we have the proclamation of Haiti as the first independent Black republic in the world. This is the beginning, really, of decolonization. It's also a major blow to African slavery in the New World. And because Haiti was lost, Napoleon felt that it was no longer possible to promote French power in North America. And so he sold French territories, which were called Louisiana, to Thomas Jefferson. And so in 1803, we have the Louisiana Purchase that doubled the size of the United States. So we see this event promoting decolonization, slave rebellion, a first Black republic in the history of the world, also geopolitical change, the neutralization of French power in North America, and France begins to look, Napoleon looks eastward rather than westward, and it makes the United States now a major power within the Americas, and it sets it on the path to becoming what we know as a global power. So all of this was part of the legacy of yellow fever. These diseases, in other words, can have, don't always, but can have a truly transformative effect on society. And I think we're seeing the potential for that in the coronavirus that we're experiencing at the moment.
I want to touch on maybe the sort of those potentials or the silos in which we should look to. But before we get to that, let me just ask you about tuberculosis, because that I found fascinating that at one point it was perceived as a status symbol to get TB.
Mm-hmm.
Will you just touch on that? I found that fascinating. And then I want to go back to sort of, round it out with the areas in which we should look for change in the wake of this. But tell us that story of TB, because that's was just I found fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. I'll talk then very briefly about TB in the first half of the 19th century. After the discovery and proof of the germ theory of disease, the story changes and we see something very different happening. But until, say, the 1880s and 90s, the ideas in people's heads matter too. And the reigning interpretation of tuberculosis was that it was hereditary, that you got tuberculosis because of your inherent constitution, and it wasn't, you were therefore innocent in a way. And the symptoms of tuberculosis were those that in Victorian ideas and certain religious ideas were very in consonant with the idea that this wasted away the flesh. It was a disease overwhelmingly of the lungs, and it wasted away the vulgar flesh, and you became thin and pale. And so the thought was that you actually it promoted your intelligence. And it was seen that tuberculosis affected the wealthy, prosperous, the elite of the 19th century. It struck Keats and Shelley and Chopin and Paganini. And so it was thought to be a disease that was going to, that promoted this glory of people's intellect and intelligence. Victor Hugo was told by his friends that although he was a great writer, it was a pity he didn't have tuberculosis, because he then had been an even greater writer. And feminine beauty, one can see this, was redefined as looking like a tubercular patient. And so it was the fashion then to be very thin and slender, You painted your face as a woman with rice powder so that you'd look pale, and you wore fashions that made you look thin and with a narrow waist, and you would even cultivate a lisp in your speech, and you might cough just lightly. And so we see a heroine like Mimi, the tuberculous heroine of opera. And thinking of the United States, if you read People Forget, Uncle Tom's Cabin is not only about slavery, it's also a novel about tuberculosis. And you get this romantic picture of a beautiful death of the heroine through tuberculosis. And tuberculosis is a horrible way to die. You asphyxiate in the fluids in your lungs, and so it's painful and awful. But this was presented by Harriet Beecher Stowe as a beautiful disease that ennobled the heroine, and she became a more lovely, more ethereal. And there was even a book at the turn of the century by an American commentator about the United States, who, as the disease was just beginning to recede, he had a terrible anxiety. This would mean that the arts, the culture, the sciences were all going to decline in the United States because tuberculosis nurtured genius, and the population of the United States clearly would no longer be able to experience that. So this was the idea of what tuberculosis was amazingly in the early decades of the 19th century down through the middle and late decades. And it all changed when tuberculosis was found to be, in fact, a disease of poverty, a disease that disproportionately affected the poor. It was called in public health, they really stressed, it's a disease not of the beautiful people, but of the ugly and filthy people. And you get then a beginning of stigmatizing the tuberculous, and the idea hotels would no longer admit people with a cough. The states in the west of the United States tried to keep people who had coughs from moving to take the so-called better air in the mountains, or even to go to sanatoria there. So it changes with how it's the way society reacted to tuberculosis really reflected a major change in the understanding of the disease, and one that promoted stigma and social, I don't want to say social distancing, that term's been adopted for something else, but it really created emphasized class barriers. Let's put it that way.
I mean, and that sort of leads into this conversation about the different directions where we could head in the wake of this. I mean, it's fascinating to me. I mean, I get the dynamic of, okay, once you find out that it's actually something you can catch, you don't want it. Once you realize like it's not fate that you're going to get this or not, that it's actually your actions, you don't want it. And I can understand how you step away from it. I don't know how you get from, I have the gene for TB and therefore I am elite. But okay, I guess, that's a different era maybe. But so what, in the wake of this, what are the, obviously it's impossible to predict exactly, what the implications of however long we have to maintain some measure of social distancing or whatever it is, it takes its form. But in the wake of this, like, what are the almost the lenses that we should be using to look out for? What are the silos of our society that we would see reflected, where we would see potential change and things that we should be looking out for if we were to have this knowledge? I mean, or I should maybe just make it easier and just say, what are the things that you're looking at based upon your knowledge of the history of pandemics and their aftermath?
Right. As you say, it's dangerous to make predictions about COVID-19. After all, it's been a human disease literally just since December, and it's very early much more is not understood about the disease than is understood. And we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know if there will be an effective vaccine or treatment. We don't know if it will be affected by the change of seasons. We don't know if it will mutate and evolve. We don't know if it will come in waves, the way, say, the Spanish influenza did, or whether it will become endemic and we have to live with it long term. All of those are, we don't know how catastrophic its economic impact will be on the global economy. It's still too early, but it seems to me there are these silos, if you phrased it, these areas of society that seem to me that I'm certainly preoccupied with, and it seems to me that we as a society will need to think about. One is clearly the way cities are planned and viewed, and it's interesting to note that the city of Milan is already adopting the view that this is likely to become a long-term disease that we have to live with, like influenza, that is seasonal influenza, and that it's therefore imperative that cities be rethought. And so they're doing some of the rethinking. One of the ideas is that people should be able long-term to practice social distancing. So they're doubling, tripling the size of sidewalks so that people will be able to shop while keeping large distances. They're trying to create as well major bicycle lanes. The reason for that is partly to reduce urban smog, but also even to keep people from taking the subway system in Milan, because they estimate that 85% of the users of the subway system go to work less than 3 miles away. And so they really might be able to be lured, knowing that after this experience with the virus, that it's much safer and socially responsible in all sorts of ways to take their bicycle instead of public transport. So we can see that the knock-on effect then is reimagining cities, reimagining our transportation system, and that includes the air transportation system, not just subways. It will mean macroeconomic rethinking, because it's clear that the environmental history of our planet coincides and is inseparable from the public health history of our world, and that if you have the creation of enormous smog, and if you destroy the environment, the habitat of animal life, then you are creating the preconditions for the prospering of respiratory diseases. So we're going to have to rethink our economy in order to have a green economy that doesn't expose us in the long term, because this coronavirus, horrible though it isn't the last word that nature will speak to us. And I believe nature is delivering a very powerful message that this is something to which our world, this kind of disease, not just this particular disease, this category of disease, is one to which we remain enormously vulnerable. And nature has delivered that message. And I think that we would be totally irresponsible and stupid or crazy not to listen carefully. We'll have to think, I think work will be rethought. We've seen that already, that whole categories of work have been brought more or less to a halt, and it doesn't look as though it's going to be easy to go back or proper to go back to what happened before. And so many, many more people are likely to be working at home. The whole tourist industry will have to be rethought and reconfigured. I believe the relationship between the wealthy countries and the world and the third world countries will have to be thought. I believe that our whole private healthcare system in our country will need to be rethought, because we're enormously vulnerable, because our private healthcare, viewing health as a commodity, never created what's needed an enormous emergency like that, a private hospital wants to have full occupancy of the beds, and the equipment should be used up to the limit as possible. Whereas a public health emergency demands planning in advance for spare beds, surge capacity, for protective equipment, for the healthcare providers, for ventilators that are beyond the needs of the moment, but are kept in supply for an emergency, bigger capacity in IC units, training of the healthcare personnel and providing them with a safe working environment and safe equipment to preserve their health. All of these things will need to be changed, as will the provision of healthcare for everyone, because healthcare depends on science. Modern public health depends on the medical authorities knowing and tracking where the disease is in real time, and that cannot be done if 30 million and more people are not within the system because they have diseases that doctors and the healthcare system know nothing about. And so a disease like coronavirus can be flourishing in the uncovered, those uncovered by the healthcare system enormously and not be detected by the healthcare system. That is an enormous vulnerability, and that will also need to be dealt with. So I see enormous rethinking of our economy and of our economic model for how a capitalist system works. I see reimagining our cities. I see reimagining what work is like and how we carry it out, get to it, and home again. I see thinking about our international relations and rethinking our healthcare system. I also would add to that, maybe we ought also to rethink our legal system, because one of the features of the privacy laws is that it was impossible for municipal health authorities to trace practice contact because those health in the healthcare system were not able to communicate who was ill and who wasn't. And so it wasn't possible to try to create social distancing by providing temporary accommodation for patients. It wasn't possible to identify the patients because of the legal system environment in which we do our business in the United States. That's another feature. And then I'm really worried, lastly, about the preparation of our leaders for such catastrophic events. And it seems to me that we have greater requirements for teenagers to drive cars than we do for leadership to be president of our country or governor of a state or mayor. And it seems to me that part of their preparation for having this enormous responsibility is understanding public health so that they will be in a position actually to lead and at the very least to understand the reports that they're receiving and help listen to their advisors to respect science. And that's part of it as well, because we live in a world in which so many sectors of our society don't believe in Darwinian evolution, or don't believe in climate science, or believe that this isn't COVID-19, this is an Asian, almost going back like to the tuberculosis idea of the early 19th century, that this is part of Chinese people's DNA, rather than something that you get because you're at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I think that we need to reconsider all of that, the role of science in our society, and the fact that science isn't the enemy. It can create technology that's devastating, but it is also scientific public health is part of our survival kit as a country, as a civilization, and as a species.
Well, I can tell you my daughter does not have her license yet, but she has had a couple of choice words for our president in terms of his ideas as of late. Professor Emeritus, Professor Emeritus of History and History of Medicine at Yale, Frank M. Snowden. The book is Epidemics and Society, From the Black Death to the Present. We will put a link at majority.fm to that book. Thank you so much for your time today. Fascinating stuff.
Thank you. I've really been delighted to be with you.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break and head into the fun half. The bubonic plague, actually, one of the things we didn't get to in our conversation was one point, it was like in the mid 1600s in Strasbourg. I know they rounded up all the Jews in the town. I think there was a couple thousand, and basically accused them of having some type of, like, it was a religious thing. Basically said, renounce your religion or die. And about half were, I think, burned at the stake like literally that day. It's on some level the modern day drink bleach in terms of the level of ignorance that's involved. Folks, it is your support that makes this show possible. Obviously, a lot of people going through financial stress. We'll be going through more financial stress in the coming months, perhaps even longer. If you are able to support this program, now would be a great time to do it. You can do so at jointhemajorityreport.com. You get the fun half. You get occasionally we'll do some other bonus stuff once we get a little settled in. I know it's been a month, but still. So any support you can give would be more than welcome and appreciated. JoinTheMajorityReport.com. If you're one of those people who want the fun half, but you don't have the resources at this time, or if you're a member and you're worried about having the resources, you can either, if you're a member, head over to the cancellation page. We got some options for you there. If you are someone who wants the fun half, send me an email at majorityreporters@gmail.com. Give me a little time, but we will get to it and set you up. Also, don't forget the AM Quickie, 6-7 minutes of headline news in the morning, free at amquickie.com or on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever. Also on the app, you can get it at majorityapp.com. Check that out. You can listen to the show live. You can watch the show live. You can get the AM Quickie. You can search the membership. It's that app also is free for your use. Don't forget justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. I now know exactly how long it takes me personally to get through a 5-pound bag of the Majority Report blend. It's almost exactly a month, a little bit more. So enjoy. Also, don't forget TMBS tomorrow night. Last week was Cornell West. You can check it out at patreon.com/TMBS or the Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. Also, tomorrow will be joining us. Nomiki Const will be here. You can check out her show at patreon.com, the Nomiki Show, or Nomiki Const on YouTube. Matt, what's going on with Literary Hangover? I think you just, I feel like we just heard part of this week's episode.
Yeah, very relevant episode this week. A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. So if you're looking for something to take your mind off coronavirus, this will not help. And we talk about...
I refute that. I refute that because I feel like hearing about other pandemics did take my mind off of this.
I agree with that too. We talk about the surveillance state and how that advances during plagues. We talk about how feudal lords didn't take any better care of their workers during this than capitalist ones do. And a lot of things like that. It's amazing how much things stay the same, turns out. They literally, he talks about social distancing, 6 feet under, those sorts of regulations come from this time where you want to bury the people 6 feet under. which has a bit of echo to the 6 feet away thing, I thought a little bit. So yeah, patreon.com/literary hangover, folks.
We will talk about your camera angle in the fun.
I know.
Jamie. Jamie, you should know that there's a mic stand headed your direction.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, I kind of like holding my microphone like I'm a stand-up comedian, but it is harder to take notes when I'm holding it.
Randy Rhodes did that back in the day on Air America. So you're in good company in terms of broadcasting. What's happening on the Antifada this week?
Well, this week on the Antifada, we got a little bit distracted the past few weeks from doing a proper Bernie postmortem. We had more pressing matters like mutual aid and space dolphin communism. However, we will be finally doing a bit of a Bernie postmortem this week, looking at the various institutional factors in why he was not ultimately successful at winning and kind of charting a course for where the left can go from here. Also, last week, we posted a new episode of The Vampire Castle, which is my side project with Leslie Lee from Struggle Session, wherein we talk about actual vampires, not social justice warriors. And in this episode, we talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer and have kind of a comradely debate over whether or not the show holds up today, particularly the dialogue. So check that out, patreon.com/theantifada.
All right, quick break. See you in the fun half. Oh, wait, Matt, hold on 1 second. Just need to remind people. I'm excited to introduce you to what is one of the coolest sponsors we've ever had, Hunt a Killer. It's a murder mystery subscription box. It's one of the most unique games out there and brings the fun of an escape room to your home. Go to huntakiller.com/majority. Use the promo code majority at checkout. You get 20% off your first box. It's huntakiller.com/majority with promo code majority. Jamie, I get the sense this might be right up your alley. All right, see you guys in the fun half.
Left is best.
Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
That's some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 8s. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Ooh. Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America. do. Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up. Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
Sam Cedar on the Majority Report. Welcome back to the program. Number 646-257-3920. So here's Nancy Pelosi apparently starting to feel some heat. There is a story in the Washington Post that was from Friday or Saturday, I should say. House Democrats have blasted Trump's response to the coronavirus pandemic as inept and dangerous. Party leaders insisted on the creation of a special committee to root out abuse. However, Democrats' hold power has largely sidelined itself, struggling so far to adopt remote voting, Zoom video hearings, or any of the alternative methods that have become standard for most workplaces in the age of COVID-19. No administration official has appeared at a congressional hearing in over a month. Committees have been unable to meet in person to debate and advance bills. There's no firm date for when the new oversight panel will start its work. I haven't had a classified briefing in over 6 weeks, said Jason Crow. The bottom line is Democrats, rank and file, are in the House are starting to get a little bit annoyed at the complete sidelining of the House in terms of leadership in this country. It's not like there's not a huge vacuum. Here's Nancy Pelosi. She was on with Jake Tapper, who apparently also has noticed that, like, what's going on here? Now, there's an interview with Joe Biden out there where he's expressing a little bit of disappointment at Pelosi and Schumer. He's not getting too out ahead of this. Later, we're going to play a clip from, of all people, God help me, Mark Cuban, who is talking like we should be hearing Democrats talk like. And we're not. And it was the other day, there were plans to vote, to open up the vote for Democrats, to figure out technologically how to have the first votes in absentia. And Pelosi quashed it. These people should be back in Washington. But if they're not, then at the very least, there should be a way for them to do their job. We figured it out. It's a pain in the ass, but we figured it out. Here's Nancy Pelosi on Sunday with Jake Tapper revealing another problem that we have in this country.
Right. You and Senator Schumer made this major concession on the most recent legislation because you made it okay. So in this one, further.
It wasn't a concession.
No. Well, I mean, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo.
I understand what Andrew Cuomo said, and I respect his perspective as a governor. But the fact is this: they wanted $250 for the PPP. We support the PPP. We're part of developing it. Small business is entrepreneurial, part of the optimism of America. So we're for that. But we wanted to include more people and more money for the program and for the hospital. So it was always an interim bill. It was always an interim bill. We always said that CARES 2 would be the bill where we would go for state and local.
Right.
And we will in a big way.
I get that, but I just want to play for you the sound from New York Governor Cuomo, because he said he needs money for his state to save New York from an economic tsunami. Take a listen to what he had to say.
We've been talking about funding for state and local governments, and it was not in the bill that the House is going to pass today. They said, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, the next bill. I said to my colleagues in Washington, I would have insisted that state and local funding was in this current bill, because I don't believe they want to fund state and local governments.
So Cuomo says he would have insisted on state funding in the last bill. And now Senator McConnell is saying he wants to push the pause button.
Yes.
Was this a tactical mistake by you and Senator Schumer?
Just calm down. We will have state and local, and we will have it in a very significant way. It's no use going on to what might have been. The administration never even wanted to do. Let me recap this for you. When we said we're not doing 250 unless you open the door for these lower unbanked, we call them unbanked businesses who don't have a fancy banking relationship or this or that, Senator McConnell said absolutely no. We're not doing one penny more than 250. And then unanimously, he passed on Tuesday $480 billion, with many of these increases, including hospitals. And what we have said for the we've been working on CARES 2. And on that, we are including not only the outlays that they have for the coronavirus, but also the loss of revenue that they have. The governors are impatient. I'm a big fan of Governor Cuomo, my own governor. Gavin Newsom has been so spectacular. My mayor, Mayor Breed, the state and local have done their jobs magnificently. They should be impatient. Their impatience will help us get an even bigger number. And that goes for Republican governors too. Governor Hogan of Maryland has been spectacular in all of this. So it's many governors, many mayors, bipartisan, for us to get the largest amount. I'm sorry that we had to have an intervention because we were going from CARES 1 to CARES 2. The intervention came, we made the most of it. And so, as I say to members, judge it for what it does. Don't criticize it for what it doesn't, because we have a plan for that, and that will happen. Well, I think you see the response, even from Republican senators, that Mitch McConnell is getting.
All right. Look, here's the problem with what she's saying. And it may happen, but it also may not. There is no more leverage. Or let me put it this way. There is what we are doing when we are bailing out. We're bailing out different sectors of society. And of course, one should hope, and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt here, that the urgency from the sector of workers, from the sector of low-income people, middle-class income people, that should be felt more dramatically by Democrats than Republicans. The sectors of finance and corporations should be felt more urgently by Republicans, not the least of which because they're in office right now. And all of these elites, including the Democrats and the Republicans, perceive this as the real economy. It's the only thing that matters. How do we know that? Because once they got their $4 trillion between essentially the capital from the CARES Act and then the leveraging of loans from the Fed, crisis averted. As far as these people are concerned, as long as the stock market has stabilized, there is no crisis as far as they're concerned. And so what you must do tactically is take any time that the Republicans perceive a crisis, which will be more often than not a political one that they are worried about, and exploit that. You want us to address your political crisis, you address our political crisis. If it makes you feel better to say policy crisis, then say policy crisis. But the leverage, now that they've paid off finance and the stock market is stable, and now that they have paid out money to small business that they perceive is their base, the leverage is greatly diminished. You're now having to rely on bipartisan pushing for funding for states and for municipalities, but that's going to come anyways. So why are you relying on that leverage? You go in and you want the small business, give us the voting. You want the small business loans, give us something that is not important to you. but is important to us. She's been sleeping on all of this, sleeping on it. Or, I mean, that's the best answer I can give you. Or she just doesn't care. There's just no sense of urgency, period.
Yeah, I mean, when Jake Tapper makes his bitch face at Nancy Pelosi, you know something's gone very, very wrong.
That's right. When he looks like, So when Jake Tapper becomes the spokesperson for the disenfranchised and the displaced in this country, yes, it is a problem. Here is Nancy Pelosi wondering whether a guaranteed income may now be worthy of our attention. And I'm of a couple of minds of this, but there doesn't seem to be anything that she thinks is really worthy of our attention. How about getting all the people who work in the House to come back to Washington? We talk about necessary workers. Number 2.
As we go forward, let's see what works, what is operational, and what needs other attention. Others have suggested a minimum income for a guaranteed income for people. Is that worthy of attention now? Perhaps so, because there are many more people than just in small business and hired by small business, as important as that is to the vitality of our economy, and other people who are not in the public sector, meeting our needs in so many ways that may need some assistance as well. But we're talking about the lives of the American people. And again, the pull and push of should we open up or not, if it jeopardizes the lives of the American people, we have to handle it with care. But again, recognize the realities of it all. What is the execution of it? What is working? And what are we getting our money's worth on? I think we have to look at that too. How is the money being spent? With all the best intentions in the world, but nonetheless, we want the money to go where it needs.
Well, it's good that they're contemplating. Maybe it's worthy of our attention now. We're 6 weeks into this. We'll see. There is a national rent strike that is being organized by the Housing Justice for All organization. And you can go and pledge. There, and I think it's over at, you just Google that. They're asking those who are able to pay May's rents to refuse to do so in solidarity with those who can't. The idea is aimed at pressuring city and state leadership to respond in the only way appropriate to the exacerbated housing crisis by canceling rent. People have yet to get their, many instances, their $1,200 worth of stimulus. Median monthly rent for a one-bedroom apartment in New York City, for example, was almost $3,000 last year. Can't pay, won't pay. All right, let's just play this one more clip, and then we'll get to the phones. What is worse than coming up onto your little daily show, having heard some guy talk about how effective things like bleach and Lysol are on surfaces, and how effective UV can be on surfaces in terms of killing viruses. And then thinking, you're so super clever to have the idea, like, what if we could do that inside our bodies? That you are so both ignorant as to that idea and ignorant to the own limitations of your God knows what addled brain you have. And you go out in front of a country of 300 million people who are stuck in a pandemic, unable to get really any solid sense of what they should be doing to deal with the coronavirus. And you just blurt it all out causing a rise to calls to the poison center across the country. Your dupes who, again, wouldn't have a problem with you shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue. They're trying it out because the president said so. They have given up on hydroxychloroquine or whatever the hell it is. They're not taking their own fish food. What could possibly be worse than that if you were the president of the United States to say publicly, well, Donald Trump followed up with an explanation for what he was really doing when he said that? Sound. We have audio on that?
We should. Let me try.
I was just looking for that one. I don't think I've got that on my thing. What's going on?
Can you clarify your comments about injections of disinfectant? They're quite provocative.
No, I was asking a question sarcastically to reporters like you, just to see what would happen. Now, disinfectant for doing this, maybe on the hands, would work.
The disinfectant, where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number on the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. So we'll see. But the whole concept of the light, the way it kills it in 1 minute, that's pretty powerful.
Okay, there's two issues here. One is he's lying, right? He wasn't asking this question sarcastically of reporters. He was turning to his own medical personnel and basically saying, like, that's my idea, just as long as we get that on the record, but check it out with medical doctors and see if that could work, maybe. He's literally turning to his medical people to his right.
Yeah,
so
that's my dry sense of humor.
It's
just
so he's clearly lying about that.
Inside joke with his medical people.
It's an inside joke, but here's the part that is really psychopathic. The idea that he thinks that if he says, no, I wasn't being an idiot in bragging about my own stupidity in trying to question whether it's possible to rinse your lungs with like Lysol or put a UV light that pierces your skin. No, instead, I was joking. I was messing with the reporters at the national press conference about the pandemic we're going through. Like, how much of a psycho do you have to be to think, oh, that's a better explanation? I was just effing around, guys. Hey, I'm the president, but I can't tell a joke. I can't pull a prank on the country. Like, got you. Punked. You got punked.
Owned.
I mean, the idea that he thinks that is like, I was just effing with the country, everybody. Stop being such jerks about it. Well, I can't joke now.
No, it's a classic deflection tactic. You see it all the time on Twitter. Someone says something that is not received in the way that they want, and then they're like, I was just joking.
Right. But they're on Twitter. They're on Twitter and nobody cares whether they're joking or not. He's the president of the United States. He's what a sick. And the idea that everybody's standing around him, God, honestly, like, start the tribunals, do it in absentia. Unbelievable. It's unbelievable to me.
It's if Twitter were real life plus death.
Go to a 308 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from? 308.
Hey, Sam, it's Kowalski.
Kowalski in Nebraska. How's things? The name of your county again?
Hall County.
Paul, it's
still leading the state.
and this is all coming from meat processing plants?
Meat processing, but now it seems to be the community at large probably has it. You can definitely say it has not helped race relations. So.
Say more.
Well, like a lot of people, I think, are just generally being hesitant around our Latin, community because of bulk of the people who work at the meat processing plant are, Hispanic or, Latin. So, yeah, there's like just people are keeping distances and stuff from them in particular, but it's like everyone probably has been exposed. So.
And what's happening? I know that Lincoln and Omaha, are they still more or less stay-at-home orders?
From what I can tell, yes. I got a few friends there. I think the governor wants to open back up possibly some businesses come like first week of May, but I think the mayors and city council members and stuff are a bit divided on that. So it might take a little more, negotiating or just to see where the hospitals and stuff are at, because according to my sister-in-law, they have been taking in a lot of patients from all over the state to Lincoln and Omaha, and they're not really at capacity yet. So there's also this idea that we need to start exposing part of the population that is not going to be as susceptible to try to build up herd immunity to get, people to not be contagion anymore.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, it seems a bit risky, but hey, I was calling in because on Friday, I just wanted to give you props because you had like the patience of Job on the phone. I've been hearing a lot of people talk about the never Biden thing and trying to leverage the progressive vote to get, something. And it's like, you can't do that at the state level. You couldn't rally the entire base to elect one guy. You're probably not going to persuade the, presumptive nominee to do anything. So.
Well, I mean, I will say this, I think it's worth a try. And, from a tactical standpoint, I also think that the guy is devoid of any real sort of ideas or plans. You look at that, there was nothing specific in the Politico interview that was done with him beyond him saying that he thinks there needs to be more than a $2 trillion stimulus, and we need to have a sort of a generic green infrastructure plan. But if you had asked me 2 months ago, would he ever even project that rhetorically, I would say no, because that's not the way that he's running his campaign. So I do think that there is some value in, this as a tactic, but ultimately, I think there's not a huge amount of leverage here. Now, they also
definitely leverage everything you have, but don't blow up the house because you want to try to have a nicer kitchen. Like priorities,
Yeah, on Friday, I read that thing. I appreciate the call, Kowalski. I read that post by Doug Henwood on Facebook.
I'm sorry I missed this discourse.
Did you not see that that Facebook post?
Nope. And what is the tactic that's being discussed for those of us who might not have been there on Friday?
Well, Mike from PA called in and was, that's the thing that was unclear to me, that I'm not quite clear what
he said he was Bernie or bust, but you can't do that anymore. So what is it? It's what or bust, right? And that's the big question that's never really answered.
Yeah, it's just unclear to me
it's bust time, right?
I guess. And I think that's obviously, I think people know where I stand on that. It's ridiculous. and it's absurd. And but Doug Henwood basically wrote a piece. Let me see if I can find that from Facebook. He just basically said, like, nobody has had more issue. I don't know, nobody, but he said, I've been having a lot of issues with, here it is. I'll read it. I've been hating on Democratic Party in public for almost 35 years, in private for longer than that. But I have to say, I don't see how anyone could deny this. If a Democrat were president now, there just wouldn't be anywhere near as many dead and doomed people. The CDC might not have been richly funded, but it certainly wouldn't have been eviscerated. Talented people not wanting to go anywhere near it. The pandemic task forces wouldn't have been disbanded and probably would have been listened to from fairly early on. Given the choice between neoliberal technocrats and proudly ignorant yahoos, I'm going to have to go with the former. I'm not going to stop agitating for a world where we could have better choices, but as long as it's a forced binary, as they say in polling business, it's an easy answer. Sorry if this disturbs anyone. It sort of disturbs me, but you have to be honest with self and others. And I think that's like, you know, the reality of the situation is such that there's no reason. Not only are we seeing the ineptness and the importance of actually just like good, you know, basics when it comes to governing, but we can also see in the context of the way that we're going to recover from this, and I'm talking in terms of economically and in terms of trying to create a stronger society that can withstand these type of crises and deal with them as they come. Biden is going to be immeasurably better than Donald Trump and everything that that means. Obviously it's not just the individuals. But I mean, I just don't know how you can dispute that. And I don't know how, you know, it's like, I don't know how, if you're talking about this as like some type of a negotiation, or like how with a straight face you can say that you don't think that, and then either assume that the other party is going to believe you. And if they do believe you, they're also going to say like, this is not someone I can negotiate with, right? Like this isn't like a normal situation. And that's just the problem. It's just like, at the very least, because of this pandemic, the position of strength is just not, there's no strength. There's no leverage. There's no leverage.
No, I agree with that. I also think on a very basic level, it just wouldn't work because we have seen the people in charge of the Democratic Party don't care if they lose. So the idea that even if it were possible to threaten to punish them with a Democratic loss to Trump and, you know, acknowledging all of the moral baggage that comes along with that these people have already considered and discarded, it just wouldn't work because they don't care if they lose. They're still going to have their jobs.
Wake up, play and fight song.
Yeah, but I'm not convinced that they don't care if they lose. I just think that that their winning is not necessarily tied into the same incentive structure that we may project. I mean, there was a lot of people who spent a lot of time in the wake of Clinton's loss, in ways that I'm sure that they didn't want to. They would have rathered she won. But I think the bottom line is just simply, it's not just these Democratic apparatchiks. It's like you're the vast majority of Democratic voters. They're not inclined to. I mean, I went on MSNBC Friday night with I wouldn't say the tamest critique of Joe Biden, but what was I thought a very dispassionate critique of what Joe Biden was doing. And the response was angry. And I think there is, I mean, obviously the audience there is going to be attuned to a specific message and against others. But there's just no leverage in this environment. New York just announced that they are taking the names of all primary challengers off the ballot if they have dropped out of the race or suspended themselves. So like literally dropped out of the race. And so that includes Bernie Sanders' name. I don't know what they'll do about it. They can maybe sue. And I hope they do, because particularly if you're doing mail-in voting, it's unclear to me why you would want to do that. Well, it's totally clear to me why you would want to do that, both in terms of, I mean, the big thing is not just, I think, a question of denying Sanders the delegates from New York. I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is, I think there's an incumbent racket going on here and a protection on certain special elections, because you know that with the more Sanders voters you get into the process, the worse chance you have if you're an incumbent. So,
yeah, folks, give Isaiah James, ISIAH, for Congress a follow, because he's going to be one of these actually good candidates that's going to get shafted by this.
And guys like Jamal Bowman.
Yeah.
There's I can't remember who's running against Elliot Engel. I gotta figure out something, how we can help that process. It's just atrocious.
I just think the leverage lies outside of the campaign for president right now.
I mean, I think that's I mean, I think, look, the bottom line is there needs to be long-term organizing in workplaces and on the ground in a way so that the left is more is in a better position to take advantage of a situation like Sanders. Also, frankly, and the opinions expressed here are my own. I say that for Jamie's sake. I think there needs to be there was I thought a very compelling Eric Levitz piece in the New York Magazine, and maybe we can talk about it more at another time. That the left at the very least now, maybe not in the future, but now has to realize that, and maybe it's false consciousness, whatever it is, the left doesn't just does not have the support amongst the working class, broadly speaking, that it wants or thinks it has. And that largely the biggest proponents of leftist ideology and leftist policies are folks who have attended college, many of whom are in the PMC. That's just one of the realities that we have. I mean, when you look at the polling for, who's a progressive, it tends to be people higher on the income spectrum, not all the way up, but higher. Then I think that there is a belief that exists amongst, those who support those policies. It's just the reality. And to build an effective left, at least in terms of policies, and that's not the only place it should be built, certainly, but you're going to have to accept that that's the coalition is going to look like.
See, if that's true, why didn't more people vote for Elizabeth Warren?
Well, I could think because they saw Sanders as having policies that they subscribe to. I mean, for let me put it this way. For that analysis to be, why didn't they vote for Elizabeth Warren? One, you have to assume that they thought that she was as electable as Sanders. Two, that you have to think that that her policies were as left as Sanders. You're making the mistake that Elizabeth Warren's appeal was to a specific demographic as opposed to a specific ideology. But the fact is that ideology that it was appealing of Sanders largely was the people in the demographic you think would naturally favor Elizabeth Warren.
I'm just saying, if you think that there is a substantial number of wealthy suburban progressives that could be convinced to vote for a leftist, that is a relatively small number, as we saw with the number of people who voted for Elizabeth Warren.
But why do you say that they weren't supporting Bernie Sanders? Like, where's the data point that says that all of her support was that the majority even of wealthy, college educated, somewhat wealthy, college educated leftists supported Elizabeth Warren?
I mean, I don't think leftists supported Elizabeth Warren, but the data says overwhelmingly her support base was highly educated, white, suburban, left liberals.
That's what made up the majority of her support.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that the majority of those people supported her.
No, that's true. That's true too. Like the majority, I really thought that she would get more support among wealthier liberals because she just seemed like a really rational choice. She doesn't say embarrassing things like Joe Biden does. She's progressive. She's a woman, but the numbers just weren't really behind her. But so I think just purely on a basis of numbers, not making any kind of ideological or moralistic argument about what class of people we want in our movement, the working class is greater in number. And maybe there's no evidence in the short term that getting more working class people out to vote would result in an electoral win for a Bernie type candidate right now. But it just shows that we have our work cut out for us. And I think it is at the very least possible, although I am very skeptical of electoral tactics on the national level at this point in time.
Right. But you're still not addressing and maybe we should table this conversation until you've had a chance to read the piece. But the point is not that it really has nothing to do with Elizabeth Warren per se. I mean, there's plenty of reasons to look at Sanders and Warren, aside from being, and make an assessment that I'm going to vote for Warren versus Sanders, that I think are discounted. Age, folks want a woman to be president. They don't see that Congress, as it is constructed now, would have been able to pass Sanders' proposals any more or less than Warren's proposals, and that what you would get would be equivalent to the extent that either one could. Some could have said that she's better at playing the inside game, and so maybe she would be trying to get a 5-pound bag, and Sanders would be getting a 10-pound bag, but she's more adept at it, and so she would be more likely to get 5 pounds than even Sanders would, even though he's going for 10 pounds. I mean, there's a myriad of different reasons, but none of that is relevant to who is the most progressive, what demographics are the most progressive, and it is college-educated people tend to be more leftist than working class people at this time. And yes, there is a project there, but in the meantime, that's just simply what the polling shows. And so in the meantime, the question is like, do you take advantage of that?
I mean, I actually did read the piece. I guess I'm taking like the number of people who voted for Warren as like a temperature check in terms of how many wealthy suburban liberals would be willing to vote for progressive. But you're right. There were many, many contingencies that had to do with the specific candidates as well. I just think if we want a long-term project of working class politics, we're going to have to look to the working class. And if the working class as it's currently constituted in this country doesn't believe in progressive policies, we need to be looking at why and what we can do to make a better case or make better policies, or conversely, change our tactics and shift them away from elections in certain cases.
What worries me is that I think Bernie might have appealed to that working class type that the professional class liberals don't, better than most of the future leaders of this party will. Like, I don't think AOC is going to appeal to them better. I don't know. I'm worried about that. I think that's the problem that Levitz might be pointing out, that it wasn't big enough to put Bernie over the top this time. And Bernie, I think, was actually fairly good at drawing some of those people out and appealing to workers and not managers, I guess, is the distinction I would make. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, on the wide angle, I agree with you. And the Bernie phenomenon, you know, it is a working class phenomenon. But I would say if you want to look at an organization like DSA, it is a relatively small and unrepresentative slice of the working class, consisting mostly of downwardly mobile middle and upper middle class millennials who, you know, grew up with a certain standard of living and now they don't have it anymore and they're mad about it. And they believe that there is something that can be done about it. And a lot of other people in the working class are depoliticized and don't believe that there's anything that can be done about it. And they think politics, especially electoral politics, are a bunch of nonsense that doesn't affect their life. And it's on the left to try to convince them otherwise. And it's not going to be easy, but you know, there are no shortcuts. We got to do it.
Let's go to the phones. Calling from a 240 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hello.
Hello, who's this?
This is Brianna from Bowling Green, Virginia.
Hi, Rihanna. What's going on? What's on your mind?
Oh, nothing much. I'm probably trying to look at a Joe Biden presidency more optimistic than a lot more progressives do, because I do believe we could make a lot more progress in a Joe Biden presidency than having another 4 years of Trump.
Go ahead.
Like because I became a lot more optimistic after your interview with Charlotte Alter, the young lady who wrote the book,
right?
The Leaders We've Been Waiting For, I think that's what it's called.
Yeah.
And it gave me a lot of hope that we lost this election. There's no doubt we've lost, and we didn't get the people out that we wanted, but our progressive agenda and everything else has basically, we won that idea. And we could probably push Joe Biden and his administration a lot further than we expect to, especially with the coronavirus going on and all these people, millions of people being out of work. And just that we have two entire generations, millennials and Zoomers, who are very left-leaning. And you see them a lot more becoming active in politics than you have seen in the past, because of people like Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, and all, and you know, AOC winning and Ilhan Omar. And I just feel like if we get more people like that elected, which is clearly possible, and we able to mobilize workers in the workplace, like back in the 1920s and 30s when the Great Depression happened. And because if you look at FDR was not a progressive at the beginning. He was a very staunch conservative Democrat. And it took the workers and the labor movement to push him further left. So I feel like we could do that with Joe Biden and with the administration, because Joe Biden doesn't really have much of an ideology at this point, especially when you can tell he has lost a step. And I think he's the type of guy who wants to please people. I think he wants to, to be looked at in a positive light. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I got to say, Brianna, I appreciate the phone call. I agree. First of all, for the people who have expectations about whether or not he can be pushed to the left, there's no doubt in my mind that he can be pushed more than those expectations. I think the environment is such, I think they are aware. I think Pelosi has more of an agenda, frankly, than even Biden does. And that agenda cuts against, I think, where things are going. But I think Biden must have a sense on some level that things are sort of flowing away from him in some way in terms of ideas. Now, that's why, these sort of small inside baseball stories about, You know, is it going to be Bloomberg's digital team that is going to run his campaign, or is it going to be a mishmash of Democratic operatives? Is so important, because it's not like you get your policy from the digital team necessarily, but the way that these campaigns work is that just whatever's working, people go with. And that's why you don't want someone like Bloomberg's team in there. You want to get other people into the mix. And so, you know, we'll see. But at least from a rhetorical standpoint, the idea that Biden is calling for something much bigger than $2 trillion, I think, is a better sign than if he wasn't. I would prefer more specificity. I would prefer more activity. I would prefer a lot more of that stuff just in terms of him. But I also think, just broadly speaking, the left does better when its foil is the center left, as opposed to a guy who, you know, an arch Republican would-be authoritarian. I mean, I just think that the left does better when the playing field shifts towards the left. That's all.
Well, I mean, we have seen in the years since Trump got elected a huge, unprecedented wave of labor activity, labor organizing, teacher strikes all across the country, et cetera, et cetera. I think there are pros and cons to both, but I agree that Biden can be pushed by outside forces and activism. Certainly, I agree that he doesn't have a strong ideology, but he does serve, like, he's been serving the moneyed interests in his state, for example.
Larry Summers does.
For decades, he's been a faithful hand servant to them.
Without a doubt. I mean, I don't want to overemphasize. I mean, I think that's, but without a doubt. But I think the whole Larry Summers thing I find very curious. Like, there's no doubt that he's meeting with a ton of different economists. That sounds like, to me, like Larry Summers announcing, like, I went in and met with Biden.
I hope so. Biden should say something about that. But I would just say, we had Mark Blythe on TMBS on Sunday, and you know, he was kind of bullish on the idea that something like universal healthcare is going to happen because of this, regardless of who wins in November, because you simply cannot bail out these insurance companies like this. It's going to be absurd. So, like, if Trump wins again, then you're going to have Trump care, folks.
I mean, I think there'll be something, and it's a question of how it gets configured. Exactly. I mean, I don't know if it's completely inevitable, but I think they're going to have to deal. I think that the establishment, the elite, whatever, and I'm not even talking the political, I'm just talking societal, is not absorbing what we are looking at, because their one bellwether is the stock market. And the fact that the stock market has stabilized has given, I think, the elite, the power elite in this country, a false sense of security. They're too detached to be aware of the implications of what's going on right now. And their one totem, essentially, is the stock market. And the trillions of dollars that flooded into corporations, into finance from the Fed, has blinded them to the reality that we're looking at. And I think at one point, they're going to be shook out of that reality. At one point, it seems to me to have to catch up, but
nothing is a given.
Nothing is a given. And here's an example of how. So Mitch McConnell gets out there and he says, we're going to let the states go bankrupt. States can't go bankrupt. But that's a technical issue. What he's doing is he's establishing, here's going to be one parameter of the debate: no help for states and municipalities. Now he's lying. He's taking a negotiation position. What is the completely out of frame position that the Democrats are taking? None. They're not taking any positions that are outside the frame. We heard Nancy Pelosi say they wanted only $250 million for the PPP. That was our idea, the PPP. We got $380 billion. Well, surprise, surprise. The Republicans would have taken 380, of course. Why wouldn't they? They don't care about spending right now. The money was going where they wanted it to go. The Democrats need to start taking positions outside the frame. Now, why is Mitch McConnell out there saying we're going to give no money to states and municipalities? Why? Because he knows that they will give money, and he wants to give them on certain terms. He wants there to be strings attached. What are those strings? On cue, here's Newt Gingrich giving you a little clue as to what those strings will be. This is the way they introduce these ideas. Here's Newt Gingrich. This is going to be the compromise position for Mitch McConnell. Clip number 5.
I do think with the dramatic decline in the economy, the dramatic decline in the tax revenue and the rise in various other costs, probably some kind of bridging amount makes sense. But I would be deeply opposed to a bailout. If you look, for example, at Illinois, which has the worst pension system in the country, grotesquely overcommitted, I don't think the rest of America should bail out the politicians in Illinois who've made a total mess of their state pension fund. So let's distinguish between a bailout and a bridging amount of money. And let's also say that states that are really out of line need to reorganize what they're doing, get their act together if the federal taxpayer is going to bail out, send them money. I don't think we should automatically assume business as usual. If they're showing up hat in hand and saying, give me the money, we had to say, fine, give us the reorganization so you're not going to get back in this shape again.
Boom. Mitch McConnell says we're not going to give any money. And then you start to get everybody back filling in what's going to happen in between. And that is, oh, we'll give you money, but you got to cut your pension. We'll give you money, but you got to stop with your municipal unions, with your state unions. You got to cut health care for them. You got to cut retirement benefits for them. That's the only way you're going to get this money.
Quite remarkable to listen to Newt Gingrich go basically say what we say on the left with regards to bailing out the cruise lines and the airlines.
That's right. That's right. And the bottom line is that what is the Democratic position on this? I mean, I spend all day reading about this stuff. I haven't seen a single talking point, a single benchmark that has been articulated by by Biden, by Schumer, by Pelosi. Nothing.
Well, Biden did call upon CEOs to voluntarily not use their bailout money for stock buybacks. So good enough for me.
The problem is they are so much better at this, the Republicans, at seizing the opportunity. They're going in and saying, we're going to need to cut pensions, city and state pensions. If we're going to bail out the states. Meanwhile, the Democrats, what's the conditions on bailing out the airlines? What was the conditions on bailing out corporations? Zero. What's the conditions on, pick it, on the tax cuts? Zero. There's nothing. What are we going to do with healthcare? Oh, we're going to bail out the insurance industry by buying their most overpriced product, Cobra Insurance. And I'm agnostic as to who's supposed to be carrying this message. Somebody from the Democratic Party said, look, Joe Biden can't say this stuff. That's why it's got to be Pelosi and Schumer. Fine. If somebody called up and said, well, Schumer and Pelosi, they need to take a back seat so that Joe Biden looks like a leader. So he's the one who's going to call for this stuff. Great. Right now, the only person I see going on television and getting very specific about proposals that we like, proposals that we're going to need inevitably. Obviously, we see Sanders doing that. We see AOC saying some of that. but I can't even say his name. Let's play this clip. Mark Cuban, ladies and gentlemen. Mark
and potentially
Cuban. Go ahead.
Many more within the space of a month, I would say you're crazy. There's just no way that's going to happen. And so dogma's got to go out the window. And so, a federal jobs program, I would have been against that. Federal minimum wage, I would have been against that. There's just so many things that I think we need to do now. And that's what entrepreneurs do. That's what leaders do.
Pause it for 1 second. Right before that, he said he used to read Ayn Rand all the time. Started from there.
I read Ayn Rand. I was, Howard Rourke. I was libertarian. I was, I thought government had a role, but smaller government was always better than bigger government. And that all changed. If you were to ask me 4 months ago whether I thought we could lose 26 million jobs and potentially many more within the space of a month, I would have said you're crazy. There's just no way that's going to happen. And so dogma's got to go out the window. And so, a federal jobs program, I would have been against that. Federal minimum wage, I would have been against that. There's just so many things that I think we need to do now. And that's what entrepreneurs do. That's what, leaders do. When you face the circumstances you have and you deal with it. Effectively, all these $1 trillion investments are a put for, but this put has got to be not for the wealthy and not for big business, but for working people. Because unless we lift up from the bottom, we're not going to have any consumer demand. And it doesn't matter how much liquidity is in the system, the risk hasn't left the system.
So, Mark, based on what you just said, this question will annoy Dagny Taggart and John Gold. But
Pause it for 1 second. Pause it for 1 second. Why? I love to hear these guys talk about how much they now think that Ayn Rand is an idiot. But listen to what he's saying. Now, I'm not terribly thrilled about the idea that it's just all basically from getting consumer power. But the reality is, at the end of the day, like the things that he does, if he puts in a federally mandated $15 minimum wage, not because it provides everyone a living wage, but because it's going to drive consumer purchasing power, fine. If he puts in a federal jobs program, great. He's talking about making literally structural change. Like, it's been a long time since the federal government did this. You know what people don't realize? You drive around, particularly in New England, but I imagine this is across the country. You see those signs that say, this is a landmark. This house was built in 1803, and this is where the Battle of Bunker Hill happened. These are all WPA projects from the last Depression. They hired historians. They hired artists. They hired architects. They hired they put everybody to work in some fashion, doing what they do best to make the country just broadly better, and simultaneously gave people an ability to live a better life. Here he goes on to talk about, I think we're going to catch him talking about the UBI here and why that's not sufficient in this instance.
Why not, after we get past, as we slowly start to bring up, why not, based on what you just said about demand, why not have the government? There are 200 million adults in the United States. Send every adult $1,000 a month. I think, forgive me because I get zeroed out. That would be roughly, we're talking about $200 billion a month. Wouldn't that be a more effective way to deal with what we're dealing with as opposed to these programs?
Absolutely not. Look, and I know the UBIers are like Bitcoiners. They're going to come and attack when I tell you what I'm about to tell you. But first, I'm not against UBI for a partner who stays home to watch children, right? That makes sense because that's a job and that has value. But I'm going to quote JFK or paraphrase JFK. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, because we need people to contribute. And while UBI is great for individuals and gives them a lot of creative control and personal control over their life, and that's great, right now we need people to contribute to the economy. And if that means a federally guaranteed job where you're working as a crossing guard managed by the folks at AmeriCorps or the people in the Peace Corps or whatever organization, then I'm fine with that. If it's a federally created job for testing and tracing, that is going to contribute to the economy because we need people to do those jobs. Otherwise, we fall behind. So maybe in another world, UBI is a great solution, but where we are today, other than for partners staying home with kids, I'm not a fan.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that's an interesting argument. I would like a partial UBI, and then I would like a federal jobs program, because the reason why I like the federal jobs program is that UBI is just easy for them to end. Federal jobs program, you're creating an infrastructure, a bureaucracy. You're getting value that is coming to. It makes the country better. And you're putting people, you're using, and I would expand it from where he's talking about. I would hire people to do what they do, meet them where they are, literally create work based upon what we have in terms of capacity as represented in the skills that the American public has at this point.
Okay, but what do you do in a situation like this one where a lot of people can't go to work and a lot of jobs can't be performed?
I mean, I think there's a whole host of jobs that can. I mean, to the extent that people can't, I think then you send them money, obviously. But I think there's a lot more that we can do. On Wednesday, I'm going to run the interview I did with the epidemiologist Michael Osterholm, and he's talking about, like, look, we can't stay in like this for 18 months, hoping and waiting for a vaccine. We need to get creative in the way that we get out in the world. And so that may mean shifts that people can go to, or, we need to be able, he doesn't have all the answers, but we need to start to figure that out. I'm sure, look, if I'm a historian, if I'm an engineer, if I'm whatever it is, in terms of creating all this stuff, I can do a lot of that from a distance. There's a lot that we can't do from a distance. And obviously you got to provide money for those folks. But there's a whole host of stuff that we can do, with particularly if you're talking about a federal jobs guarantee, theoretically, you would have people trained. Now, look, here's the reality is none of this stuff is going to be pulled off well with the administration we have now. They are incompetent beyond, I think, a way to articulate. You could drop $1 trillion into this thing right now, and they still wouldn't be able to do anything with it. What we're talking about really is January of 2021. But the ideas should be out there, because we're going to have this problem until then, particularly from an economic standpoint, but more than likely from a medical one as well.
Yeah, I totally love just south of my hometown, actually close to where the Dakota Access Pipelines were blockhouses made during that era by the Citizens Conservation Corps, which if memory serves, was only open to white males, which is an improvement we need to make now. I think what Jamie is reacting to with the Cuban thing negatively is it does seem like he wants to maintain the ability to continue coercing labor to do those essential jobs like the contact tracing. And yeah, I think that's where it's like, no, we need to give everyone the UBI, definitely. And then we need to incentivize them with more payments, like good government jobs, to actually get out there.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm happy to hear him talk all this stuff about Ayn Rand.
Contrast that to what we're hearing from anybody
Who
else.
it is.
Has the word federal jobs program even been bandied about besides anybody guests on a podcast? Well, I guess he's a guest on a show there, but
yeah,
nevertheless.
Totally.
And I should add, the next part of that interview, he talks about how he's funding an organization to get basically his name on the ballot.
Oh, wow.
I think it's great that he started talking about the realm of social reproductive labor, the act of producing people, as we've talked about on this show before, raising children. This is not just something that women do because it's in their nature. This serves a function in the economy and should be compensated as such. I mean, there's been a demand for compensation for social reproductive labor going back many decades in socialist feminism, and it's meant to be like a step on the way to a post-capitalist society where everybody has their basic needs met just by virtue of being human. But you know what? I'll take it, Mark Cuban.
I can't wait for him to be a guest on the Antifada.
I mean, literary hangover, do Ayn Rand.
Here's Steve Doocy really missing the point about Sweden's approach to COVID-19. This is on Fox and Friends. They're looking deep into this stuff, folks, because you know what they don't want to do? They don't want to talk about the president who's calling for people to drink bleach.
Talking about the experts, you know, I'm sure that a month and a half ago, the health experts went to the president and said, Mr. President, if you do not shut down the country, 250,000, 500,000 people will die, and you don't want that on your record. And obviously that's the tact he took. But, you know, ultimately, we don't know what we don't know, because we don't know if this approach actually is working. You know, a year from now, we'll know whether or not Sweden was right, where they essentially isolated the vulnerable and everybody else has not been locked down.
Yeah, Steve, that's a great point. That's the pattern of catastrophes in our country, whether we're talking about natural catastrophes or terrorist attacks or even something like the coronavirus. At the beginning, it's perfectly reasonable when we don't know how profound the threat is to give our executives the chance to get their arms around it. But all threats are dynamic, and we have to figure out over time, okay, here's what we're dealing with, here's what's at stake, here's what the different interests are, and what's the reasonable way of balancing those interests. And over time, what's supposed to happen is we're supposed to remember that what's at stake here are fundamental rights, and government is created first and foremost to protect your fundamental rights, not to regulate them.
You know, here's the thing about Sweden. They are the 10th highest in the world with deaths per 100,000. They have not taken apparently some of their officials are saying that they're going to reach herd immunity within a couple of months, but nobody knows if that's true. They haven't done enough of the testing. And on top of that, they have a whole infrastructure in which to deal with illness and death and folks staying at home and not going out. We have none of that. We are suffering from this pandemic in like literally various types of ways. One, because we have a completely incompetent government, just a total lack of leadership up top. Two, because they have done their best to dismantle any of our ability to respond. Three, because structurally our society is such that we have no mechanism to help society in any real comprehensive way. We have a patchwork of like plugging holes somewhere, but we don't have a national healthcare system. We don't have a national system to make sure that people really can eat, right? It's all horse trading at one point or another. Can we get extra money for SNAP? Can we expand? Can we subsidize COBRA? These are all, we're just plugging holes. We have no way of providing assistance to people. We have no mechanism in which to get everybody on the same page, no social cohesion, no leadership whatsoever. We could not do what Sweden's doing, and even Sweden, it's not even clear that they can do what they're doing without enormous amount of death.
I mean, call it a thought experiment if you want, but I just have a feeling that a society where people don't avoid going to the doctor if they don't have any money would do better at handling a pandemic. Call me crazy.
Exactly. I don't think that they have the comorbidity concerns that we have, frankly. Here is our next president of the United States. He will be running against Mike Pence in 2024. Tom Cotton. I'm, of course, being a little facetious. He's on Fox News. And what's Tom Cotton? What beat is Tom Cotton on? He's on the "we know who the real enemies are" here beat.
It's a scandal to me that we have trained so many of the Chinese Communist Party's brightest minds to go back to China to compete for our jobs, to take our business, and ultimately to steal our property and design weapons and other devices that can be used against the American people. So I think we need to take a very hard look at the visas that we give to Chinese nationals to come to the United States to study, especially at the postgraduate level in advanced scientific and technological fields. You know, if Chinese students want to come here and study Shakespeare and the Federalist Papers, that's what they need to learn from America. They don't need to learn quantum computing and artificial intelligence from America.
Well, they're certainly making sure that anybody in China is learning the culture of China. You make a good point. Let's make sure.
All right. First off, I should just remind Tom Cotton that Shakespeare is not American.
Yeah, no.
Oh, you got that?
Yeah, Matt, wasn't he the other literary genius here? He was born in one of the territories, right? Before it was an actual state. It was like the Dakota Territory, or maybe it's like Colorado.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, I was ready to weigh in that he was born actually in England, as the literary expert here.
I appreciate that. But the point that Tom is making, I think everybody gets. If they want to come here and learn about white culture, then they can. But then they have to go back. But you know what's a funny story? Here's a funny story about this. Brendan, check out that link I just sent you. Pop this up. Here's a stunning story by ProPublica. The Trump administration drove him back to China, where he invented a fast coronavirus test. Story of a Chinese professor, 59 years old. He did what apparently many academics do, which is failed to fully disclose on a disclosure form the Chinese academic appointments and funding he would get. He was working at a university in Florida, and he taught for about 25 years at, I think it was University of Florida, raised 2 sons in Gainesville, Florida. He was a participant in the 1,000 Talents program, which is China's aggressive effort to lure top scientists from the U.S. universities. He had been working part-time at Hunan University for even longer than he had taught at Florida, right? You have appointments at different universities. That happens all the time. And then he started to get pressure from the federal government, and he left. And then when he got to in 2019, and then he was one of the guys who basically developed a super quick test for coronavirus that they're using apparently in China. So lessons learned. Thanks, Tom.
It's kind of scary, but this context, it reminds you of Nazi conception of Jewish science a little bit. And I mean, really what they're doing, the right wing with this, I think, is attacking higher education in general, because these students often pay the full tuition to go there. These are like huge money makers for students. And yeah, it's going to hurt. I mean, higher ed better buckle up, because I think some major structural changes are coming there.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I'm just surprised Tom Cotton is so confident that those crafty Orientals aren't going to figure out a way to use Shakespeare against this great country of ours.
That's right. Be careful with your Shakespeare. Maybe dipped in coronavirus. Continuing on the theme of the right has in its demonization of China, this is, I feel like to a certain extent, the administration has tried to give up on this as a distraction, but I'm sure they'll come back around to it. Here's Fox News on the yellow peril beat, going after Katie Porter, who says that it was a mistake for the Trump administration to get rid of the CDC people who are embedded in China to basically be on the watch for a potential pandemic.
evidence that the cases that began to pop up and expand in the United States actually came from Europe. They came from China. This is a global phenomenon, and we should think about it that way.
Why though?
And right now,
but you say it's a global. Hold on, Congressman. We can all reasonable people can agree this began in China, and the Chinese weren't truthful about it, right? Or are you questioning that?
we can definitely agree that it began in China, and we can definitely agree that we should have had more transparency with what was happening in China, which is why it's important.
Why is it so hard to say we should hold them responsible?
Allow me to finish. Because we currently in the United States have the largest number of cases in the world. And we are going to likely, given the trend that we are seeing, continue to have the largest number of cases in the world.
Hold on, is it just a quick travel? Could that possibly be because the Chinese didn't tell the truth about the number of cases and the number of deaths that they have, and we are telling the truth?
We should absolutely be pushing for answers and doing that investigation. Okay. And that's why funding for the World Health Organization, which is the entity that does
and you trust it. So hold on, you trust, wait, hold on, I'm fascinated here. So you trust the WHO as an independent and legitimate service to do this investigation?
The WHO is the entity that helps coordinate world health. Hence its name, World Health Organization.
Clearly you view them as an independent arbiter.
That's not a substitute. That is not a substitute for the United States using its sovereign power to demand answers from China, which we should have been doing in late December, in November, in early January. Instead, we were evacuating thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans from China back to this country and having to deal with the infectious disease risk that creates. The reality is that we are in a global economy, and that global economy is a big reason for the economic engine that is the United States. So do we need answers from China? Absolutely. We should be demanding them.
We appreciate it. I think the administration has. I'm not sure they're all that happy with the answers they get.
Yeah, no. Donald Trump, I think, was a little bit more concerned with loans that he has with China and dealing with its trade deals. But the bottom line was just the Republican ideology led us to cut the wasteful presence of CDC scientists and medical personnel in China who were observing for potential pandemics there. I mean, that was what their job was. All right, folks, we're not going to get to any more calls. I apologize. Time went quickly, but let's play this last clip of the day. Jamie, come up with a couple of reasons why the left, and really even the center left, and maybe even the center right, hates Donald Trump. Come up with two.
He's orange.
Okay.
And, you know, the left is very racist against orange people. And he talks stupid.
Wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. I'll tell you why, Jamie. Because he's a real man. Guys like me on the left, we can't handle that. We get a little bit nervous around real guys. That's at least what Seb Gorka told me.
But it's not just a large part of why he was elected, Boris. Let me add, it's also a large, large part of why the left hates him, isn't it?
Oh, sure, of course.
Because it's that the alpha male. I said, it's the left hated it when I tweeted out first week in the White House, the alpha males are back. They can't stand that. In an age where masculinity is deemed to be toxic, in an age where they say sex and gender is a function of choice. It's fluid. Yes, fluid.
You're a man or woman, whatever.
Then when you see a 6'2" guy stand up there for 2 hours every day and bat the idiot questions away from the so-called journalists, that is the opposite of everything they want America to believe, isn't it?
We're having fun here, we're chatting, and I remember during the campaign, I've thought about this. If you think about just in your life who the biggest Trump haters are that you know, it's not really the cool kids. Let's be honest.
It's not the manly men. It's not the manly men.
It's both men and women, right? It's not the people who are truly secure in themselves.
No.
The men and women I know who support the president know who they are.
Right.
They for sure know what
and they're the kind of guys and gals you want to hang out with. They're the kind of guys you'd want to co-host a podcast with, right? Am I right?
They're the kind of men and women, exactly. The kind of guys and gals, men and women.
Could you imagine having to have fun with Brian Stelty?
Well, why is it? What is Stelty? Is that the guy from CNN?
Yeah.
Well, that's just a weird example, I guess. That so Jamie, the cool kids hang out with Boris Epstein and Seb Gorka. Haven't you seen Seb Gorka's? What kind of car does he have?
Mustang.
It's got a Mustang.
That is pretty cool.
I have to confess, at a Michael Brooks Show live show, somebody who went to college with Boris was there and said he actually was kind of popular. But I would also like to point out, just going to share the screen here, Boris got let go from Sinclair a few months ago. And I would just like to show his page is still live. We can see what his final subscriber count is here. It was 452. So hate to see that, but
It's a very exclusive club.
Very exclusive. Oh, the cool kids. There's the sad part is there's not many cool kids left. They've all died.
Oh God.
Orca and Boris Epstein start a podcast together. That seems like they're alluding to it. That would be pretty powerful.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. Move over, dirtbag left.
Bromance with Seb and Bo.
I have to concede one thing. I've got to confess to something. Someone sent me an email that purports to be that links to a some type of classic porno site. And the pornos are narrated by someone who sounds very similar to Seb Gorka. And I sent it. We got to find some type of like voice test.
A blur effect or something.
We got to figure out if we can maybe look at the speech patterns and see if we can find something like that. Put it into the supercomputer.
Yeah, we can find
I can do a spectrum analysis.
A forensic analysis.
Yes,
I have a program that I can legitimately do a spectrum analysis.
All right. Well, we got to do that, I think, for tomorrow, because you need to watch I could not hear him talk without thinking that might have been him. But
wow.
Jamie, Matt, Brendan, folks, thanks for joining us. We will be back live tomorrow at noon. Stay safe.
Give me just 1 second here. Oh, 1 second, sorry.
All right. Well, in the meantime,
here it is. 1 second.
Stay safe.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bulb. But finding out won't make me feel any better.